On December 25, 1991, a flag was lowered over the Kremlin, not torn down, not burned, simply lowered. And in that quiet moment, the largest country by landmass that had ever attempted to remake human society from the ground up ceased to exist. No invasion caused it. No revolution overthrew it. The Soviet Union, which had industrialized a continent in a single generation, which had absorbed 20 million deaths in one war and kept moving, which had placed the first human being in orbit around the Earth. That state dissolved itself, largely peacefully, in an afternoon. But here is what almost no one asks. The structural contradictions that ended it in 1991 were not accidents that crept in over time. They were present at the very beginning, written into the architecture of the system by the same minds that built it. Father Georgy Gapon led ordinary workers through the snow toward the Winter Palace in January 1905, believing the Tsar would listen. Nicholas II was not even in the building. That single absence, power refusing to meet the people it claimed to protect, echoes forward across the entire century. So the real question is not how the Soviet Union fell. The question is how, carrying that contradiction from its very first breath, it lasted as long as it did. And while you are down there, I would love to know. Was the Soviet Union's collapse an inevitable consequence of how it was built? Or did it take specific failures of specific leaders to finally bring it down? But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. The cold arrives before the light does. That is how January works in St. Petersburg. The darkness holds a little longer than it should, and when the morning finally comes, it comes gray and flat, pressing down on the Neva ice, on the cobblestones, on the rooftops of a city that has not yet decided what kind of day this will be. The snow on the ground is old snow, the kind that has been walked on and refrozen, and walked on again until it is more like pale stone than anything that once fell from the sky. The air does not move. The cold is not a weather event. It is simply the condition of existence, the medium through which everything in this city happens in January, the thing that is always there beneath whatever else is occurring. It is the 9th of January, 1905, by the old Russian calendar, a Sunday, and the city is not still. They begin to gather before the sun is fully up, men in their work coats, women with children held close against them, old men who move slowly and carefully on the ice, young men who move quickly and then slow down to stay with the people around them. They come from the factory districts, from Vyborg and the Narva Gate and the Vasilievsky Island and the Putilov Works, which has been on strike for days now. And they come in the particular way that large human gatherings always come together. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, one person, Anne, D, then another, and then a family, and then a crowd, and then something larger than a crowd, something that begins to feel like a portion of the city itself deciding to move. They carry icons of the saints, the kind that hang in the corners of their apartments above the small oil lamps that are kept burning through the night. They carry portraits of the Tsar. Some of them carry nothing at all except themselves and the cold and whatever it is they have come to say. They are singing hymns. This is the detail that history must not rush past. Tens of thousands of people moving through the snow of St. Petersburg on a Sunday morning, singing, carrying the images of their faith and their sovereign, as if the two things are not entirely separate. Because for these people, in this moment, they are not. The Tsar is Nicholas II, and he is understood not merely as a political leader, not merely as the head of a government or the commander of an army, but as something older and stranger than either of those things. He is the Little Father, the earthly embodiment of a covenant between God and Russia, the figure through whom divine authority descends into daily life. This is not a metaphor the people in this procession are using loosely. It is a structure of belief, as real to them as the cold beneath their feet, as real as the hunger that has brought them here, as real as the icons they hold up against the grey St. Petersburg sky. At the front of the procession, or rather at several fronts, because this is a gathering that moves from multiple directions toward a single point, there is a priest. His name is Father Georgy Gapon, and he is 32 years old, and he is not the kind of man who exists comfortably in the abstraction of historical summary. He is a man who has spent years in the Narva district, in the neighborhoods where the factory workers live, in the particular geography of insufficient wages and 12-hour days and apartments shared by too many people and children who are hungry in a way that is not occasional but structural. He knows what it smells like in those rooms. He knows what the workers' hands look like after a week at the machines. He has organized a workers' assembly with the knowledge and partial encouragement of the police, which is its own strange irony. A mutual society meant to channel discontent into something manageable, something that would not become something else. But the hunger has become something else anyway. The strike at the Putilov works has spread, and now Gapon is here, in the cold, at the front of a procession of extraordinary size, carrying a petition. The petition is a document of modest, desperate hope. This must be understood clearly, because it is the whole point of what is about to happen. The petition does not call for the overthrow of the autocracy. It does not demand a republic, does not invoke the language of revolution, does not threaten. It asks. It asks for a 10-hour workday. It asks for fairer wages. It asks for an end to a war with Japan that ordinary Russians did not choose and cannot understand. A war fought on the far side of an empire so vast that most of the men dying in it have never seen the territory for which they are dying. It asks that the Tsar hear his people directly, without the ministers and the courtiers and the layers of bureaucratic distance that separate the Winter Palace from the factory floor. The petition addresses Nicholas as one might address a father, with the assumption that the father does not know, that if he only knew, if the distance could be bridged for one moment, things would change. "We are impoverished and oppressed," the petition reads. "We are treated not as human beings, but as slaves." The petition is signed by tens of thousands of names. What Gapon believes, what the people walking beside him believe, is that the Tsar will receive them. That is the whole architecture of the morning. The icons, the hymns, the Sunday, chosen deliberately as a day of peace. The portraits of Nicholas carried not as a provocation, but as a declaration of loyalty. They are not coming to threaten the little father. They are coming to reach him. The Winter Palace stands at the center of a city that the Tsars built to announce their modernity to Europe. A city of canals and classical facades and bridges over the Neva. A city that is in many ways more of a statement than a place. The palace itself is a monument to the idea of absolute power made beautiful. Its green and white facade stretching along the embankment in a declaration of permanence. Inside its walls, the rooms are gilded and vast and heated. The distance between those rooms and the factory districts is not a distance that can be measured in miles. Nicholas II is not there. He is at Zashkoye Selo, the imperial residence outside the city, where he spends much of his time with his family, removed from the capital and its complications. He does not know, or does not fully know, what is moving through his city this morning. His diary entry for this day will note that it was a painful day. It will say that there were serious disorders in St. Petersburg. It will not say much more than that. This is not a detail to be held against him with contempt. Contempt is too simple an emotion for what is happening here. It is something quieter and more terrible than contempt. His absence is not a choice made this morning. It is the product of an entire system, an entire way of being a ruler, in which the distance between the palace and the people is not a failure of attention, but the very definition of how things work. The Tsar rules by divine right, and divine right does not require proximity. It requires only itself. The soldiers are positioned at the approaches to the Winter Palace. They have their orders, though the precise nature of those orders and who gave them will be disputed for as long as the event is studied. When the procession approaches, singing, carrying icons, carrying portraits of the man in whose name the soldiers stand, the soldiers open fire. The narration does not dwell here. The moment does not require elaboration. There is a sound, and then there is snow of a different color, and then there is a silence that is not the silence of the morning, but something else entirely, something that has no name in the vocabulary. The people in this square brought with them to the day. The number of dead is disputed. The government says a figure. Other counts say other figures. Hundreds, certainly, perhaps more. Governments that produce inconvenient numbers have a long history of disputing them, and the government of Nicholas II is not unusual in this regard. What cannot be disputed, what no official count can alter, is the color of the snow in the square afterward, and the icons dropped in the cold, and the portraits of the Tsar face down on the cobblestones. The day comes to be called Bloody Sunday. The name is simple and accurate, and it sticks in the way that names only stick when they have earned their weight. Across Russia, in the weeks that follow, there are strikes and protests and a spreading, formless rage that the government will spend the rest of the year trying to contain. Nicholas will eventually issue a manifesto promising a parliament, a Duma, certain civil liberties, concessions that satisfy no one fully, that infuriate those who believe any concession is weakness, and disappoint those who understand that the concessions do not go far enough. The year 1905 will come to be called a dress rehearsal, which is a phrase that implies a main performance is coming, and it is, though the people living through 1905 do not yet know when or in what form. But the dress rehearsal metaphor, useful as it is, misses something. It suggests that the real meaning of the day is what it predicts, and the real meaning of the day is what it ends. What dies on that square is not merely a crowd of petitioners. It is an idea, the idea that the Tsar and his people exist in a relationship of sacred mutual obligation, that the autocracy is not merely a political arrangement, but a covenant written into the nature of things, and that the little father, however distant, however insulated by the machinery of empire, is ultimately on the side of those who suffer. The people who walked through the snow that morning carrying icons and singing hymns were not naive. They were not ignorant of the hardness of their lives. They knew what hunger felt like and what cold felt like and what it meant to work until your body was used up. But they believed, and this belief was not stupidity. It was a structure of meaning that had organized Russian life for generations. They believed that the man at the center of the empire was bound to them by something more than politics, that he was their father in some sense, that the word father carried its deepest weight. The petition Gapon carries asks not for revolution. It asks for the Tsar's personal attention. It asks only to be heard. That is the whole of it, in the end. The desire of a people to be heard by the one who is supposed to love them. And the answer comes back in the form of rifle fire, from a man who is not even present to give the order, in a palace he is not in, on a Sunday that ends before he fully understands it has begun. That idea, once it bleeds out into the St. Petersburg snow, does not come back. Not in 1906, not with the Duma, not with any of the reforms that follow. Something has been shown that cannot be unshown. The soldiers fired on people carrying icons. The little father was not there. The covenant, it turns out, was not mutual. And the people who survived the square carry that knowledge forward into the next 12 years, and the 12 years carry it forward into everything that follows. And this story, vast and terrible and not yet begun, descends from this morning, from this cold, from the echo of gunfire and the silent sea that comes after it, settling over the snow like a judgment that no one in the Winter Palace is present to hear. To understand what breaks in 1905, you have to understand what existed before the breaking. An empire so large that a traveler boarding a train in St. Petersburg and riding east would spend more than a week in continuous motion before reaching the Pacific coast, passing through climates and lung. ages and centuries all at once. The Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century is not a single coherent nation in the modern sense, but something older and stranger, a vast accumulation of territories held together by the authority of a single dynasty, the Orthodox Church, and the slow, enormous weight of tradition. It is a world that has lasted a very long time, and that longevity feels, to those at its center, like permanence. The land itself defies easy comprehension. Forests so dense that light does not reach the floor. Steppes so wide that a rider can travel for days without a landmark to fix his position. Rivers that are themselves the size of smaller nations. The Volga alone carries more water to the sea than all of England's rivers combined, and it is only one of dozens. The empire contains within its borders tundra and desert, mountain ranges and river deltas, the frozen silence of Siberia, and the warm complexity of the Caucasus. More than 100 distinct peoples live inside these borders, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping in mosques and synagogues and churches of half a dozen denominations, living by rhythms that have nothing in common with each other except the fact of Russian rule. This is not a nation. It is a world that has been told it is a nation. And at the center of this world, binding it together with the force of divine appointment and 3 centuries of dynastic continuity, is the figure of the Tsar. The Little Father, as ordinary people call him, a term that carries inside it the entire structure of the relationship. Not a politician, not a president, a father, sacred, distant, responsible for everything and answerable to no one except God. The peasant world, which is to say the world of most Russians, does not change quickly. The emancipation of the serfs comes in 1861, and it is a genuine legal transformation. The serf is no longer property, no longer bound to the land by law, no longer subject to sale. But the economic logic that produced serfdom does not dissolve with the decree. The freed peasant still needs land to survive. The land still belongs to someone else. The redemption payments the emancipation requires, the installments the peasant must pay over decades to compensate the former owner for the loss of his labor, become a new form of bondage, invisible to law but utterly visible to hunger. A man who cannot afford the land he works is not free in any sense that his body understands. The village at the turn of the century looks, in most of its particulars, very much like the village of a generation before. The wooden houses. The communal fields divided into strips so that each family bears an equal share of the good soil and the bad. The seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest that have organized human life in this part of the world for longer than anyone can accurately remember. The priest. The icon corner. The endless negotiation with weather and debt, and the quiet, accumulated weight of precarity. A bad harvest is not an inconvenience, it is a catastrophe. The margin between sufficiency and starvation is narrow enough that it disappears in a single dry summer, and there have been many dry summers. The peasant does not think in terms of systems or ideologies. He thinks in terms of bread, in terms of the coming winter, in terms of whether his children will eat. This is not ignorance. It is a form of knowledge that the palace, 3 weeks away by road, has no framework to receive. The court exists in a different relationship to time entirely. In the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, which is itself a city built by Peter the Great on a swamp because he wanted Russia to face Europe, a city of canals and neoclassical facades that looks more like Amsterdam than Moscow. French is the language of polite conversation. The aristocracy reads French novels, attends French operas, corresponds in French with relatives across the continent. The distance between this world and the village is not merely a matter of wealth, though the wealth is staggering. It is a distance between different relationships to the future, to what is possible, to what the word Russia even means. The aristocrat who summers at his estate and winters in the capital is not cruel in any simple sense. He is genuinely unable to see across the distance he has spent his life creating. The peasant is a figure in the landscape, part of the scenery of Russia, the way the birch trees are part of the scenery. Present, necessary in some vague sense, not quite real in the way that a person at dinner is real. This is the empire at its center, beautiful, insular, and organized at every level to prevent the kind of seeing that might require a response. Nicholas II comes to the throne in 1894 at 26, following the sudden death of his father Alexander III, a man of enormous physical presence and iron political will. Nicholas has neither. He is slight, gentle, genuinely devoted to his wife and children, capable of real warmth in private settings, and constitutionally unsuited for the role history has handed him. He is not stupid. He is not monstrous. He is a man who has been taught, with the thoroughness that only an absolute system can manage, that reform is the first step toward dissolution, that to concede anything to the pressure building outside the palace windows is to begin the process of conceding everything, and that the proper response to pressure is not adaptation but endurance. He mistakes stubbornness for principle. He mistakes the refusal to see for the strength to hold. He is, in the deepest sense, a man whose education has made him precisely wrong for his moment, and his moment will not forgive him for it. There is a photograph of Nicholas that survives from this period. He stands in military uniform, his expression composed, his eyes carrying something that looks almost like sadness, as though some part of him already knows something he cannot articulate. He loves his children with a completeness that is entirely genuine. He reads to them in the evenings. He walks in the gardens of the palace at Tsarskoye Selo with his wife Alexandra and his son Alexei, who has hemophilia, whose blood does not clot, whose every bruise is a crisis, whose suffering becomes, in time, a doorway through which a man named Rasputin will enter the court and accelerate its isolation from everything outside its walls. But that is later. For now, there is just a young Tsar who does not know what he does not know, standing at the center of an empire that has arranged itself very carefully to make sure he never finds out. Meanwhile, in the cities, a third world is assembling itself. The industrialization of Russia in the final decades of the 19th century is rapid and disorganizing. Factories rise in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and in the industrial regions of the South and the Urals. And into these factories pour the surplus children of the countryside, young men and women who have come from the villages because the village cannot hold them, because the land has been divided and subdivided until the strips are too narrow to support another family, because the city at least offers wages, however small, however uncertain. They live in tenements, 6 and 8 to a room. They work 12-hour shifts. They are cold in winter and hungry in ways that the factory wage almost but never quite resolves. They are learning to read. And reading, in the Russia of the 1890s, is a dangerous activity because the things being written down and passed from hand to hand in the tenements and the meeting rooms are not merely novels. There is a theory circulating in these rooms, in these pamphlets, in these dangerous conversations. It holds that the industrial working class, the proletariat, in the vocabulary being borrowed from German philosophy, is the true revolutionary force of history, and that it requires guidance, not because the workers are incapable, but because history moves in ways that require interpretation, and interpretation requires a certain kind of discipline. The theory argues for a small, tightly organized party of professional revolutionaries, a vanguard. The word means the front edge of an advancing force, who will act with clarity and decisiveness, while the larger mass of people is still in the process of understanding its own situation. The party does not wait for consensus. The party sees what is coming and moves first. This is, in the quiet of the pre-revolutionary world, an almost academic argument. It appears in pamphlets. It is debated in émigré circles in Zurich and London and Paris. Among its most insistent advocates is a young lawyer from the Volga city of Simbirsk, the son of a school inspector, a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who has taken the name Lenin. He is precise, relentless in argument, and absolutely certain that he is correct. In 1900, he is in exile, writing, arguing, waiting. His ideas are a seed in frozen ground. The ground has not yet thawed, but the ground is full of seeds. The peasant who cannot pay his redemption installment, the factory worker sleeping six to a room, the student reading pamphlets by lamplight, the soldier who will one day be sent to a front he cannot understand for a war he did not choose. All of them are living inside the empire, inside its vast and ancient feeling weight, inside the story it tells about itself, that it is permanent, that it is sacred, that the little Father watches over all of it with divine authority and genuine care. The petition that will be carried toward the Winter Palace on a January morning in 1905 is, in this light, something more than a list of grievances. It is an invocation. It is the last attempt by people who still believe in the covenant of the autocracy to call upon its terms, to say, "We are your children, we are suffering, and we are asking you, our Father, to see us." The workers who march behind Father Gapon carry icons not because they are naive, but because the icon is the correct language for the relationship they are trying to invoke. They are speaking to the Tsar in the only vocabulary the system has given them for speaking to power. They believe, most of them, that if Nicholas knew, if he could only see, he would respond as a father responds to a suffering child. That is what the covenant promises. That is what the covenant has always promised. They do not know that the covenant is already a fiction. They do not know that the distance between the village and the palace is not a distance that letters or petitions or even icons can cross. They do not know what the soldiers know, standing in formation with their rifles, waiting for an order that they will receive and obey, because the empire has taught them that obedience is the only virtue that matters. The empire, from the outside, looks like permanence. Those vast territories, that ancient church, that dynasty with its 300 years of unbroken rule. But permanence is often just pressure that has not yet found its release, and the Russia of 1900 is full of pressures that the court cannot see, because it has arranged itself so carefully not to look. The world before the crack is a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary injustice held in a tension that cannot hold forever. The crack, when it comes, does not seal. That is the thing about Bloody Sunday that the court fails to understand in the weeks and months that follow. The shooting stops, the square is cleared, the official reports are filed, and Nicholas II writes in his diary that it has been a painful day, and yet something in the relationship between. The Tsar and his people has passed through a door that has no handle on the inside. The year 1905 does not end with that January morning. It becomes something larger and stranger. A full year of convulsion, of the empire shuddering and lurching and somehow remaining upright, surviving not through wisdom or strength, but through a combination of partial concession and the revolutionary movement's own disorganization. It is, in the precise and terrible sense of the phrase, a dress rehearsal. The same moves are being practiced here that will be performed, with far greater consequence, 12 years later. The same actors are taking their positions. The same arguments are being made in the same back rooms. Only the outcome differs. And it differs not because the underlying forces are weaker, but because the crown still has just enough to offer, just enough to divide the opposition, just enough to make the moderates believe that something might yet be salvaged from within the existing order. History, in moments like this, has a quality almost of mercy. It shows you what is coming. It runs the catastrophe at lower volume with softer lighting, and it gives you time, if you are paying attention, if you have the will and the capacity to change what is about to happen. The Russia of 1905 is being shown exactly this. Whether anyone in a position of power is truly watching is another question. In June, sailors aboard the battleship Potemkin, anchored in the Black Sea off the coast of Odessa, refuse to eat meat that is rotten with maggots. The refusal becomes a confrontation. The confrontation becomes a mutiny. and then something happens that sends a current through every revolutionary organization in Russia and beyond. The red flag rises over an imperial warship. It is not a military event of great strategic consequence. The Potemkin eventually sails to a Romanian port and surrenders. No fleet is captured, no battle is won. But that is not the point, and the revolutionaries who are watching from the underground understand immediately that that is not the point. The point is the image. The point is what it means when the men the Tsar relies upon to enforce his order turn the instruments of that order against him. The point is that the Navy's discipline, like the army's loyalty, like the peasantry's deference, is not a fixed condition but a negotiation, and the terms of that negotiation are shifting. The signal fire travels. People who have been waiting to see whether resistance is possible now have their answer, and the answer is visible from the harbor. The strikes that spread through the industrial cities that summer and autumn are not coordinated in any modern sense. There is no central committee issuing directives, no unified platform, no single organization capable of channeling the pressure. What there is, instead, is a kind of atmospheric change, a sense, spreading through the factories and the railway yards and the print shops, that the old deference has become optional. Workers in St. Petersburg form councils, Soviets in Russian, improvised democratic bodies that are making decisions in the absence of any legitimate authority willing to make them. The word Soviet is not yet weighted with the history it will accumulate. It simply means council. It means people trying to govern the immediate crisis of their own lives in the vacuum that the autocracy's rigidity has created. In the countryside, the peasants are seizing land. They do not wait for permission. They do not file petitions. They simply take what they have always believed, in some fundamental and inarticulate way, should belong to those who work it. The manor houses of the gentry burn in the night across the central provinces, and the light of those fires is visible from a long distance, and the distance between that light and the Winter Palace is not measured in miles, but in the complete failure of the court to understand what it is looking at. 2. As idea. Nicholas II blinks. It is October, and the pressure has built to a point where even the most conservative voices around him are telling him that something must be given, that the alternative to concession is the kind of total collapse that concession might still prevent. He issues the October Manifesto, which promises civil liberties and a legislative assembly, a Duma with genuine lawmaking power. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, more than anything the autocracy has offered in 300 years of Romanov rule, and the writer who treats it purely as cynical theater from the outset does a disservice to the complexity of the moment. There are people, liberals, moderate socialists, members of the professional classes who have been arguing for exactly this kind of constitutional order, who read the October Manifesto and feel something that is not quite hope but is in the neighborhood of hope. The possibility exists, for a brief and fragile interval, that Russia might find its way toward a constitutional monarchy, that the Tsar might become something like what the British Crown had become, a symbol of continuity rather than a locus of absolute power, a figurehead for a state that governs itself through law. Nicholas is constitutionally incapable of living inside that possibility. This is not a judgment of his character in the ordinary moral sense. It is something more structural, more tragic. He has been raised from birth inside a theology of autocracy, not as metaphor, but as literal sacred obligation. The Tsar does not merely exercise power. He is the vessel through which God's order flows into the Russian world. And to surrender that power, even partially, even to a representative body, is not a political compromise. It is, in Nicholas's understanding of his own existence, a kind of apostasy. He makes the concession because the alternative in October 1905 is immediate collapse. And then, as soon as the immediate pressure eases, he begins the slow work of taking it back. The franchise for the Duma is narrowed. the assembly's powers are curtailed before it can exercise them in any serious way. The fundamental laws of 1906 reaffirm that the Tsar retains ultimate authority over all matters of governance, that the Duma can advise but cannot compel, that the autocracy has not, in the end, consented to be governed. The liberals who had allowed themselves that brief interval of hope begin to understand that they have been offered a door that opens from only one side. The Duma will meet and argue and be dissolved when it becomes inconvenient, and meet again under narrower terms, and the cycle will repeat until the institution discredits itself and the moderates who stake their credibility on it are left without a position to occupy. In the background of all of this, quieter and more insidious, is the apparatus of the Okhrana, the Imperial Secret Police, which has been operating since the 1880s, and which by 1905 has developed a particular and disturbing sophistication. The Okhrana does not merely surveil the revolutionary underground, it infiltrates it. It runs agents who rise to positions of genuine influence within the organizations they are betraying, who help plan operations, who sometimes help carry them out so that the line between revolutionary and informant becomes impossible to draw from the inside. The paranoia this generates is not irrational. It is, in fact, the only rational response to a situation in which any colleague might be reporting your conversations to the police. Trust becomes a liability. Organizations fracture along lines of suspicion, and the state, in a grim irony, helps produce the very radicalism it is trying to suppress. Because the moderate, the reformer, the person willing to work within the system is perpetually undercut by a system that has decided in advance that no one can be trusted to work within it. Father Gapon is the fullest expression of this horror. He leads the March on Bloody Sunday, not as a revolutionary, but as something more complicated. A priest who has been, at various points, in contact with the Okhrana, who may have believed that organizing workers under official auspices was the only way to give them any protection at all, who leads is people toward the palace carrying icons and singing hymns, and is answered with rifle fire. After the massacre, he flees abroad. He returns. He negotiates with the socialist revolutionaries. He's accused of being a police agent. He may be. He may have become one, or may have always been one, or may have been something that the categories of agent and revolutionary cannot quite contain. In 1906, he is found hanged in a rented cottage in Finland, killed by the socialist revolutionaries, who have concluded he is a traitor. The Okhrana does not mourn him. Why would it? He is simply one more instrument that has served its purpose. The quiet horror of his fate is not that he was betrayed, but that the system made it impossible to know what he was, made betrayal and sincerity indistinguishable, made every gesture of good faith into a potential performance, turned even the act of walking toward the palace with a petition into a move in a game whose rules he may never have fully understood. It is against this backdrop that Pyotr Stolypin arrives. He becomes Prime Minister in 1906, and he is, in the fullest and most serious sense, the last best argument that the Tsarist system makes on its own behalf. He is not a liberal. He is not a revolutionary. He is a conservative of unusual intelligence, a man who understands that the existing order can only survive if it gives the people within it a genuine stake in its continuation. His agrarian reform program is the center of his vision, a plan to dissolve the old commune system, the mir, and allow peasants to consolidate individual holdings, to become, in effect, small property owners with a direct interest in the stability of the society that protects their property. It is, in its way, a profound insight. The peasantry is the majority of Russia. If the peasantry can be given land, real land, owned land, not communally held land subject to periodic redistribution, then the revolutionary argument loses its most powerful audience. A peasant who owns his farm is not the same political creature as a peasant who works land that belongs to the commune or the gentry. He has something to lose, and people with something to lose are, historically, the enemies of total revolution. Stolypin does not have time. The reforms begin, and in some provinces they begin to take hold, and the vision of what Russia might become, a society of smallholders, of rural property owners, of peasants bound to the existing order, not by coercion, but by genuine economic interest, is visible, if only barely, on the horizon. He says himself that he needs 20 years of peace to transform Russia. He does not get 20 years. He does not get 10. In September 1911, at a performance of the opera in Kiev, in the presence of the Tsar himself, a man named Dmitry Bogrov shoots him twice. Stolypin dies 4 days later. Bogrov is, in the way of these things, connected to the Okhrana. The full truth of who ordered what and why is never established to anyone's satisfaction, which is, itself, a kind of answer. What dies with Stolypin is not merely a man, but a possibility. The agrarian reform continues in a diluted form, but without his drive and his political intelligence, it loses its coherence and the window closes. 20 years later, when Stalin collectivizes Soviet agriculture, he will be destroying precisely the class of independent peasant farmer that Stolypin was trying to create. And he will be doing it with a violence that makes the failure of the Stolypin reforms look, in retrospect, like a door that the 20th century walked through and could not find its way back from. The ghost of what Stolypin was attempting haunts the entire Soviet period, a road not taken that becomes, under collectivization, a road actively demolished. After Stolypin, there is no one. The Duma continues to meet and to be ignored. The reformist energy of 1905 has been exhausted without having accomplished its essential purpose. And in the meantime, in the private world of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the royal family has been contracting around a single terrible fact. The Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the Romanov throne, has hemophilia. He bleeds internally from the smallest injury. He suffers episodes of such agony that the doctors can do nothing but watch. And into this private catastrophe, in the years after 1905, steps a man from Siberia named Grigory Rasputin, a wandering holy man of dubious reputation and undeniable presence, who appears to be able to do what the court physicians cannot: to calm the child, to stop the bleeding through means that no one can explain, and everyone, in their desperation, prefers not to examine too closely. Rasputin is not the cause of the autocracy's failure. He is its symptom. He is what the autocracy looks like when it has retreated so completely from the world it is supposed to govern that its most intimate decisions are made in a private room, on the basis of a mother's terror and a father's helplessness, with no accountability to any institution or any public. He represents the court's final contraction, the imperial family, turning away from the pressures building outside, from the Duma and the workers and the peasants and the revolutionary underground, and turning inward toward a mystery it cannot solve and a grief it cannot share. The empire moves toward its fate in something that feels almost like a trance. The windows of the palace are lit at night. The world outside is full of signals that something is ending. And inside, the family gathers around the sick child, and the faith healer prays, and the Tsar writes in his diary, and the distance between that gilded interior and what is coming grows smaller with every passing season, invisible to the people inside it, legible to almost everyone else. When the First World War begins in the summer of 1914, something unexpected happens in the streets of Russia's cities. The crowds that have spent a decade carrying grievances toward the government now carry flags toward it instead. The workers who have been striking, the students who have been agitating, the peasants who have been watching the land reform promises dissolve. For a moment, for a strange and genuine moment, all of that recedes. War has a way of doing this. It offers a grammar larger than private suffering, a story in which personal grievance can be briefly subsumed into something that feels like collective purpose. It is not cynicism that fills the streets of Petrograd in August 1914. It is something real, something felt, even if it will not last. Nicholas II stands on the balcony of the Winter Palace and looks out at the crowd below. And for perhaps the last time in his reign, he looks like a man whose authority is genuinely felt rather than merely endured. The cheering rises up to meet him. He is not a man built for moments like this. He is private, interior, more comfortable in the diary entry than in the public gesture. But history does not consult a man's temperament before assigning him his role. He accepts the adulation. He does not fully understand it, and he will not be able to hold it. But for this one afternoon, standing above the crowd in the amber light of a Russian summer, he is what a Tsar is supposed to be. The moment will not last. The war that Russia enters in the summer of 1914 is not the war it is prepared to fight. This is not a secret. The military leadership knows it. The ministers know it. Even Nicholas, in his more lucid moments, understands that the machinery of the Russian Imperial Army, its supply lines, its officer culture, its communications, its industrial base, is not calibrated for modern industrial conflict. What no one fully understands, or perhaps what no one is willing to say plainly enough, is how quickly that gap between what is required and what exists will become lethal. Not lethal in the abstract, lethal in the specific, in the bodies of men at the front, in the particular and accountable deaths of soldiers who go into battle without enough shells, without enough rifles, sometimes without enough boots. The shell shortage is not a footnote, it is a diagnosis. By the early months of the war, Russian artillery units are being rationed to a handful of shells per day, while the German guns across the line fire without apparent limit. The supply lines that stretch across the vast interior of the empire are long and slow and badly organized, and the men at the front receive what the system can deliver, which is not enough, and what the system cannot deliver, which is everything else. The officer culture, aristocratic, proud, educated in the traditions of a previous century's warfare, has not made the adaptations that the Western Front has already, at tremendous cost, begun to force upon its combatants. The distance between the men in the trenches and the men making decisions about the trenches is not merely organizational. It is the same distance that has been the empire's defining structural failure for a generation. The distance between those who bear consequences and those who do not. Tannenberg comes in late August of 1914, just weeks into the war. The Russian Second Army, advancing into East Prussia, is encircled by German forces in a battle that becomes one of the most complete military disasters of the entire conflict. Nearly 100,000 Russian soldiers are taken prisoner. Tens of thousands more are killed. General Alexander Samsonov, commanding the Second Army, rides into the forest and shoots himself. It is the kind of detail that resists elaboration. A man alone among the trees, at the end of his calculation of what he has done and what he cannot undo. The understatement of the moment is itself the statement. The war is 10 days old, and yet Russia does not collapse. That is the thing that is easy to forget, looking backward from the revolution that eventually comes. For 2.5 years, the Russian army fights. It absorbs losses that would end the participation of smaller nations. It adapts imperfectly and unevenly. In 1916, General Alexei Brusilov launches an offensive on the southwestern front that is genuinely innovative in its conception, genuinely devastating in its execution, and genuinely costly to the Austro-Hungarian forces it is aimed at. The Brusilov offensive is one of the most successful operations of the entire war. It is also, in the accounting of Russian lives spent, catastrophic. The empire can still produce military achievement. What it cannot produce is a system capable of converting achievement into durability, of building on success without consuming the men who made it possible. The summer of 1915 brings a crisis that forces a decision whose consequences will define the final 2 years of the dynasty. Germany launches a massive offensive, that drives Russian forces back across a front of hundreds of miles. Entire provinces are abandoned. The army retreats in disorder. And in the middle of this disaster, Nicholas II makes the choice that his advisors, his ministers, his own cousin, the Tsar of Britain, plead with him not to make. He decides to go to the front and take personal command of the Russian military. The logic, as Nicholas understands it, is the logic of the dynasty. The Tsar is the father of his people, the embodiment of Russia's will, and if the army is suffering, then the Tsar must be present to rally it. It is a medieval logic applied to an industrial war, and it is not entirely without its own kind of courage. Nicholas is not a coward, and he is not going to the front as theater. He believes genuinely that his presence matters. What he does not understand or cannot bring himself to understand is what his presence means for the mathematics of failure. From this point forward, every defeat is the Tsar's defeat. Every retreat is the Tsar's retreat. The dynasty's remaining legitimacy, which is already diminished and already fragile, is now attached directly to a military campaign that the structural realities of the Russian state make it very difficult to win. He goes to the front. He leaves Alexandra in Petrograd. And this is where the story of the court enters its final, most surreal phase. Not because of any single decision, but because of the accumulating distance between how the court understands itself and how the rest of the country has come to see it. Alexandra is not a foolish woman. She is devoted, serious, and possessed of a genuine will to govern. But she is also deeply isolated, deeply German by birth in a country now at war with Germany, and deeply, completely in the grip of her faith in Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian mystic whose apparent ability to ease her son Alexei's hemophilia has made him indispensable to her in a way that defies Ional accounting. Rasputin's influence over the court in these years has become, in the retelling, something close to legend, and legend always simplifies. What is true is this: while Nicholas is at the front, Alexandra writes to him constantly, and her letters are full of Rasputin's counsel, his opinions on ministers, on military appointments, on policy. Ministers who displease Rasputin are dismissed. Ministers who court his favor advance. The result is a government that rotates through its leadership positions with a speed that makes coherent administration nearly impossible. Each new appointment carrying with it the particular flavor of the court's internal politics rather than any relationship to competence or circumstance. In a single 80-month period, Russia goes through 4 different prime ministers, 5 different ministers of the interior, and 3 different ministers of war. The country is fighting the largest war in its history, and its government is being reshuffled on the advice of a peasant mystic from Siberia. The aristocracy watches this with a horror that is not entirely without self-interest. In December of 1916, a group of men that includes Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, lures Rasputin to a basement and kills him. The killing is elaborate, confused, and strange. Poison that does not work quickly enough, shots fired, a body dumped in the Neva River. The details have the quality of a story that a dying civilization tells about itself. Overwrought, mythologized even in the moment of its occurrence, more operatic than the plain facts of power and its absence require. The men who kill Rasputin believe they are saving the dynasty. They are not saving the dynasty. The dynasty is beyond saving. What they are doing is removing a symbol while leaving the structure that produced it entirely intact. By the winter of 1916, the front is doing something that no Russian military authority has the capacity to stop, and that no imperial decree has the power to reverse. The soldiers are leaving, not in dramatic mutiny, not in organized revolt. They are simply walking away. Men who have been cold and hungry and unled for 2.5 years. Men who have watched their comrades die for positions that are then abandoned. Men who have received orders from officers who do not know their names, fighting a war whose purpose has become, in the arithmetic of daily survival, impossible to identify. The logic of self-preservation is overcoming the logic of duty, one man at a time, hundreds of thousands of times. They are not making a political statement. They are making a human calculation. They are going home. This is the moment that the ghost of Pyotr Stolypin returns, not in triumph, but in its most painful form. Stolypin, who was shot in a Kiev theater in 1911 while Nicholas watched from the royal box, had understood something about the relationship between the peasantry and the state that his successors never fully grasped. His land reforms, imperfect, incomplete, cut short by his assassination, were aimed at creating exactly what the empire now, in its hour of maximum need, discovers it does not have: a peasant class with a stake in the existing order. A man with his own land, his own future, his own reason to defend the system that gave it to him. The soldiers walking away from the front in the winter of 1916 are the men Stolypin's reforms might have reached. They are the men who might have had something worth defending. They are walking because they have nothing, and the empire has given them nothing, and the empire is now asking them to die for it, and they are declining, quietly, one by one, in numbers beyond counting. In Petrograd, the bread lines are growing longer. The city is the imperial capital, the administrative heart of an empire at war, and it cannot reliably feed its own people. The women who stand in those lines in the pre-dawn cold are not revolutionaries. They are cold and hungry and tired. But they are beginning to say things. The police informants. And there are many, because the security apparatus of the Romanov state is elaborate and well-funded, even as everything else decays. Write down what they hear and send their reports to the government. The reports arrive. They are read. They describe a population that is losing its willingness to endure, a city that is approaching some threshold that the informants cannot name precisely but can feel. The government reads the reports. It does not change course. It does not have a course to change. It has ministers who will be replaced next month, and a Tsar at the front, and a war it cannot win, and a population that is running out of bread. What is coming is not a revolution in the way that word is usually understood, not a sudden uprising, not a dramatic seizure of power by a disciplined vanguard. What is coming is something more like an acknowledgement. The empire has already collapsed from within. The institutions that hold a state together, the loyalty of the army, the authority of the government, the faith of the people in the basic legitimacy of the arrangement. These things are not simply strained. They are gone. What remains is the form of the thing, the titles and the ceremonies and the Winter Palace with its lit windows, and underneath the form there is almost nothing. The acknowledgement of that fact, when it comes, will be swift. But the fact itself has been accumulating for years. In every unfilled shell casing, every retreating regiment, every bread line stretching around the corner in the winter dark, every soldier who puts down his rifle and begins the long walk home. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives in the form of a situation that has already occurred, waiting only to be named. In Petrograd, in February of 1917, the naming begins with bread. The city has been hungry for months, not the hunger of famine, not yet, but the grinding, humiliating hunger of a great capital that cannot feed itself, that watches the supply trains fail to arrive, that watches the prices climb beyond what a factory worker's wages can reach. The women who stand in the bread lines before dawn are not political women, most of them. They are wives, mothers, daughters. They have sent their husbands and sons to a war that has already swallowed millions. And now they stand in the cold before the shuttered bakery windows, and they wait. And sometimes the bread does not come, and they go home with empty hands to children who are also waiting. It begins with those women. Not with a manifesto, not with a vanguard party, not with any of the elaborate theoretical machinery that the revolutionary movements have been constructing for decades in their meeting rooms and exile apartments. It begins with hunger and with the decision, less a decision than a reflex, to stop waiting and to say so out loud, in the street, in numbers. The strikes start in the textile factories on the Viborg side of the city. Women workers walking out. The strike spreads. By the second day, there are perhaps 200,000 people in the streets. The Cossacks are sent to disperse them, and the Cossacks ride into the crowds, and the crowds do not run. A Cossack winks at a woman in the street. It is a small gesture. It is everything. It means the men on horseback understand, somewhere beneath their orders, that the women they are being asked to drive away are not enemies. They are Russia. The government orders the garrison troops to fire. And here is the moment that undoes everything, the hinge on which the century swings. The soldiers hesitate. Some of them fire into the air. Some of them refuse outright. And then, on the fourth day, a regiment mutinies entirely, shoots its own officers, and joins the crowds. Then another regiment. Then another. The garrison of Petrograd, the military force on which the autocracy depends in its own capital city, simply walks away from its obligation, not in a dramatic act of political conviction, but in the oldest and most human of ways. They look at the people in the street and they recognize them. The women in those lines are their mothers and their sisters. The boys throwing rocks at the police windows grew up in the same villages they did. The abstract loyalty to the Tsar cannot survive that recognition. Nicholas II receives the reports at Stavka, the military headquarters to which he has gone to be closer to his armies, and which has instead placed him at a remove from everything that matters. He orders suppression. He orders the Duma dissolved. The orders travel down the wire and they are not followed. And then the telegrams become slower. And then they stop coming altogether, and the silence that fills the space where his authority used to be is the loudest thing in Russia. His generals speak to him one by one, and they tell him what they know, that they cannot support him, that the army cannot be turned against the people, that the situation is beyond recovery. These are not revolutionaries speaking. These are the men who have served him, who have commanded his armies, who believe in military order and chain of command, and they are telling him that the chain has broken. He sits with this information on a train that cannot reach Petrograd because the railway workers have taken the switches, and he makes the only decision that remains available to him. He picks up a pencil. He writes. The abdication document is not a grand thing. It does not sound like the end of 300 years of Romanov rule. It sounds like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been told that he is allowed to put it down. He abdicates in favor of his brother Michael, and Michael declines within 24 hours, and the dynasty is simply over, not executed, not overthrown in any clean dramatic sense, but dissolved like something left too long in water. Nicholas boards his train again and travels to his family at the Alexander Palace. And the guards at the gate are new men now, and they make him wait. There is a temptation to read his abdication as failure, as weakness, as the inevitable end of a man not equal to his moment. But the more honest reading is perhaps simpler than that. Nicholas II believes in autocracy not as a political philosophy, but as a sacred trust, a burden given to him by God. And when God's instrument, the army, the state, the loyalty of his people, is no longer available to him, he does not know how to be a Tsar without it. He never learned to be anything else. He hands over 300 years of dynasty in pencil, on a train, in the middle of Russia. And the grief in that image is real, even if the grief is his alone. What comes next is the provisional government, assembled hastily from the members of the Duma and the moderate socialist parties, and it inherits a situation that would challenge any government under any circumstances. The war is still ongoing. The economy is in collapse. The supply systems are broken. The army is demoralized. And across Russia, in every city and town and factory, Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers are forming spontaneously, claiming their own authority, issuing their own orders, creating a second power that exists alongside the provisional government and answers to no one but itself. Alexander Kerensky is the figure who comes to embody this government, and it is important to understand him clearly. He is not a fool. He is not a coward. He is a man of genuine democratic conviction, a lawyer and an orator, someone who believes that Russia can build a liberal republic from the ruins of the autocracy. He wants elections. He wants civil liberties. He wants a Russia that takes its place among the democratic nations of the world. These are not small things to want, and in a different moment, in a country that is not fighting a catastrophic war, that is not starving, that is not governed simultaneously by two competing authorities. These things might have been possible, but Kerensky makes the decision to keep Russia in the war. He makes it for reasons that are not unreasonable. Russia has treaty obligations to its allies. The Allied powers are pressing him, warning him that withdrawal will be seen as betrayal, that it will invite German terms that will dismember the country. He fears, not without justification, that a separate peace will look like collapse, will invite the kind of territorial concessions that will define Russia's weakness for a generation. He launches a summer offensive in 1917. He calls it, with a kind of desperate optimism, a demonstration of Russia's renewed democratic spirit. The offensive fails. It fails quickly and at enormous cost, and what it costs is not merely territory or men, though it costs both of those things in abundance. What it costs is the last reserve of patience that the soldiers at the front and the workers in the factories have been extending to the moderate men in the government. The argument that the war must continue is a reasonable argument. It is a logical argument. It simply does not speak to anything that the exhausted, hungry, bereaved population of Russia is capable of hearing anymore. The gap between the reasonable argument and the lived human experience of that argument is where the provisional government loses its grip on the future, and the gap is absolute. Into this gap, in April, a man steps off a train at the Finland station in Petrograd, and the atmospheric pressure of Russian politics changes. The sealed train requires explanation because the explanation matters. Germany does not send Vladimir Lenin back to Russia out of generosity. Germany sends him back because Germany understands, with the cold strategic clarity of a nation fighting a two-front war, that Lenin is the most effective weapon available for destabilizing the Eastern Front. A Russia convulsed by revolution is a Russia that cannot fight. The Germans are not wrong. They are simply unable to anticipate that the weapon they are deploying will eventually threaten far more than their own enemies. Lenin arrives with almost no popular base in Russia. He has been in exile for years. The Bolshevik Party is a small faction, disciplined and organized, but numerically minor compared to the socialist revolutionaries or the Mensheviks. He steps onto the platform and delivers what will become known as the April Theses. And the people who hear him are startled, and some of them are alarmed, and all of them understand that something unusual is happening. The April Theses are remarkable not for their complexity, but for their simplicity. Lenin is not offering a nuanced program for gradual reform. He is not talking about treaty obligations or constitutional procedures or the careful management of transition. He is saying, end the war now. Give the land to the peasants now. Give power to the Soviets now. All power to the Soviets. Peace, land, bread. 3 words, 3 promises. Each of them aimed with surgical precision at the 3 things the Russian people most desperately need in the spring of 1917. The Bolsheviks' rivals dismissed this as demagogy, as irresponsibility, as the reckless promises of a man who has no idea what governing actually requires. They are not entirely wrong, but they are missing something important. something that Lenin understands and they do not. In a moment of total institutional collapse, the gap between a promise and its delivery is a problem for later. The problem for now is power. Whoever holds power will determine what Russia becomes, and the faction willing to make the promise, willing to act on it immediately and ruthlessly, willing to take the decisive step while the others are still deliberating. That faction will hold power. This is the vanguard theory arriving at its historical fulfillment, not in the abstract, not in a pamphlet, but in the actual unfolding of events. The small, disciplined group moving while the larger forces hesitate. Lenin has been theorizing this for 20 years. Now the theory and the moment find each other, and the fit is almost frightening in its precision. Through the summer, the Bolsheviks grow. Through the summer, the provisional government weakens. There is an attempted coup from the right, the Kornilov affair, and Kerensky arms the Bolsheviks to defeat it. And in doing so, he hands them both weapons and legitimacy. By October, in the Bolshevik Military Committee, Leon Trotsky is organizing. By October, Lenin is pressing from hiding, writing letter after letter urging action, afraid that the moment will pass, that the window will close, that the exhausted patience of the Russian people will somehow be redirected or managed or survived by the moderate men. It will not be. The October seizure, the event that will be called the October Revolution, that will be mythologized in paintings and films and anniversary parades for the next 70 years, is, in its actual occurrence, almost quiet. It happens in the night of October 24th and into the early hours of October 25th. Red Guard units and Bolshevik-aligned soldiers move through the city in the dark, taking the railway stations, the telephone exchanges, the bridges, the post office, the state bank. There is almost no resistance. A provisional government that has been losing its grip for months discovers, in the space of a single night, that the grip is gone entirely. The Winter Palace is surrounded. The ministers inside wait in an almost surreal calm, playing cards, sending messages that no one answers, waiting for help that does not come. The cruiser, Aurora, fires a blank round into the night, a signal, not an attack, and the doors of the palace are opened, and the ministers are arrested and taken to the Peter and Paul fortress, and it is over. Kerensky is not among them. Earlier in the day, understanding what is coming, he leaves the Winter Palace in a car borrowed from the American embassy, flying an American flag to get through the checkpoints. He is going to find troops, he says. He is going to rally the front. He will be back. The car drives through the streets of Petrograd and out of the city. And Alexander Kerensky, the moderate, the Democrat, the reasonable man who believed that a liberal Russia could be built in the wreckage of the autocracy, disappears into the autumn dark. He does not come back. Lenin stands before the Congress of Soviets that night and announces that the provisional government has been overthrown and that power has passed to the Soviets. The hall erupts. Some of the delegates cheer. Some of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries walk out in protest. And Leon Trotsky, watching them go, says something that will echo across the coming decades, that they are consigning themselves to the dustbin of history. The phrase is contemptuous. It is also a statement of method. There will be no loyal opposition in what is being built here. There will be no loyal anything except to the party and to the theory and to the man who holds them both. In the noise of that hall, in the eruption of voices, it is possible to hear two things at once. One is the sound of genuine hope, the hope of workers and soldiers who have been promised peace and land and bread and who believe in this moment that the promise will be kept. The other is harder to name. It is the sound of a door closing on a particular kind of future. The future of the reasonable men, the deliberating men, the men who believed that the complexity of governing a vast and broken nation required patience and compromise, and the slow, difficult work of building institutions. That future is not available anymore. Whether it was ever truly available, Whether the conditions of 1917 could have produced anything other than what they produce is a question that historians have argued ever since and will argue still. But the door has closed. And behind it, on the other side, something new is beginning to take shape in the dark. It is not yet clear what it will become. It is not yet clear that its makers know. What is clear is that the men who now hold power believe, with a certainty that admits no qualification, that they understand the direction of history and their role within it. That certainty is their greatest strength. It will also become, in ways that cannot yet be seen from inside the noise of that October night, the deepest source of everything that will go wrong. But that is later. For now, the hall is still erupting. The car is still driving away. The winter is just beginning. The morning comes grey and cold over Petrograd. The noise of the hall has faded. The speeches are finished, and the Bolsheviks, who have just seized the machinery of the state, sit down to discover that the machinery does not work. This is the inheritance, not triumph, inheritance. The desk is covered in someone else's unfinished correspondence. The drawers are full of someone else's half-formed plans. The war is still grinding on at the front, consuming men at a rate that no ideology can justify and no army can long sustain. The economy has not merely slowed, it has, in any meaningful sense, stopped. The old administrative apparatus, the vast bureaucratic skeleton that held the empire together through inertia and habit, is gone, and nothing has yet grown in its place. The provisional government dissolved like paper in water. The Tsar's civil servants have either fled or are sitting at their desks waiting to see what happens next, which is itself a form of resistance. And outside, in the streets of every city, in the villages of every province, in the trenches of a front that stretches hundreds of miles, there is a population that has been promised three things: peace, land, and bread, and is waiting, with a patience that is already running thin, to see whether those promises will be kept. Lenin understands something that his critics will never fully grant him. He understands that a promise made in a moment of revolutionary fervor is also a debt, and that debts come due. Within days he moves on the peace question, not elegantly, not on favorable terms, but with the cold pragmatism of a man who knows that an army that has been walking home since summer cannot be turned around by a decree. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March of 1918, is a humiliation by any measure. Russia surrenders enormous territory, enormous population, an enormous share of its industrial capacity. Lenin's own comrades are appalled. He signs it anyway. The war for Russia is over. The cost of ending it is staggering. The cost of continuing it would have been the revolution itself, and Lenin knows the difference between a wound and a death. But peace at the front does not mean peace inside the country. What follows is not one war, but many, layered over each other in a way that resists clean narration, because it is not a clean thing. It is a landscape of competing armies and competing hungers and competing visions of what Russia is and what it might become. And ordinary people are caught inside it, the way a field is caught inside a fire, not choosing sides, but burning. The white armies of the old regime gather in the south, in Siberia, along the periphery, backed by foreign powers. Britain, France, Japan, the United States, who are alarmed by the Bolshevik seizure of power and unwilling to let it consolidate without a fight. The whites are not a unified force. They are generals and aristocrats, and monarchists and liberals and Cossacks, who share a common enemy but almost nothing else. And their inability to agree on what they are fighting for will prove, in the end, more decisive than any battle. Then there are the Green Armies, the peasant forces, anarchist in spirit, if not always in name, who want neither the old regime nor the new one, who want the land to be theirs and to be left alone with it, who fight whoever is nearest with a ferocity born of centuries of having nothing and being as, cared to give more, And then there are the nationalist forces. Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Poles, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, peoples who look at the empire's collapse and see not catastrophe, but opportunity, a chance at the self-determination that the war had promised and the great powers had not yet delivered. While into this chaos, Leon Trotsky does something that should not be possible. He builds an army. He begins with almost nothing, a collection of Red Guards, workers' militias, volunteers, and deserters who have been walking away from the front for months. He has no military experience in any formal sense. He has never commanded anything larger than a meeting. And yet he understands, with the intuition of a man who has spent his life studying how power moves, that an army is not primarily a military institution. It is an organizational one. It requires not just soldiers, but supply chains, not just bravery, but logistics, not just ideology, but discipline. He reinstates former Tsarist officers, a decision that outrages his fellow Bolsheviks, because he needs men who know how to read a map and move a division, and ideology cannot substitute for that knowledge. He attaches political commissars to every unit, not merely to enforce loyalty, but to explain, in terms that a peasant conscript can understand, why this particular fight matters. And he moves. This is the image that history preserves, and it deserves a moment of attention. An armored train moving through a disintegrating country, moving toward wherever the line is about to break. Trotsky is on that train, working, writing, arguing, deciding. And the train becomes a kind of mobile headquarters for a war that has no fixed front, no stable geography, only the continuous emergency of a country trying to hold itself together while being pulled apart from every direction simultaneously. What makes Trotsky extraordinary in these years is not ideology. It is improvisation. He arrives at a crisis and makes a decision and moves on before the decision can be second-guessed. And the cumulative effect of 1,000 such decisions made under conditions of radical uncertainty is an army that can fight and, eventually, win. The Bolsheviks win the Civil War by 1922. They win it not because the people choose them. The peasantry, who constitute the vast majority of the country's population, largely want to be left alone and would choose neither side if choosing were an option. They win because their opponents cannot cohere, cannot agree on a common program, cannot translate military force into political authority. And they win because they control the center, the cities, the railways, the organizational machinery. In a country where the state has already collapsed, the faction that can reconstruct the sinews of administration, even crudely, even coercively, holds an advantage that popular sentiment cannot overcome. But winning the war does not end the suffering. It does not even pause it. The famine of 1921 and 1922 must not be rushed past, because rushing past it is one of the ways that history becomes dishonest. Between 3 and 5 million people die. They die in the Volga region, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in the places where the harvest has failed and the grain requisitioning squads have already taken what little remained. They die in villages so remote that the outside world does not learn of them until months later, if at all. They die in the way that the very poor have always died in famines. Not dramatically, not in the manner that lends itself to narrative, but quietly, in doorways and in fields, with a diminishing capacity to seek help and a diminishing number of people left who have anything to give. Maxim Gorky, the writer, appeals to the world on their behalf. Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration sends food. It saves lives, hundreds of thousands of lives. And the Soviet government accepts the help with a resentment that it will never fully acknowledge, because accepting help is an admission that the revolution has not yet solved the problems it promised to solve. Lenin looks at what the country has become after 4 years of World War, 3 years of Civil War, and the accumulated devastation of famine, and he makes a decision that costs him something. In 1921, he announces the new economic policy. It is, in essence, an ideological retreat, a partial restoration of market mechanisms, a permission for small private enterprise, an admission that the attempt to leap directly from feudalism to communism has outrun what the country can survive. The true believers are appalled. Lenin frames it as a tactical withdrawal, a necessary pause before the next advance, and perhaps he believes this. But there is something else in it too, a moment of reckoning, quiet and almost private, in which the architect of the revolution acknowledges that the blueprint and the building are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is filled with human cost. He does not have long to live with this knowledge. By 1922, Lenin has suffered the first of several strokes that will progressively diminish him. He is 52 years old. He was, for all his ruthlessness, a man of genuine theoretical power, a man who had spent 30 years thinking about how power works and what it is for. Now he sits in a room in Gorky, outside Moscow, and the room grows smaller. He dictates notes, what history will call his testament, in which he assesses his potential successors with a clarity that his failing body cannot act on. He writes of Stalin that he has concentrated too much power in his hands and that he is not certain. Stalin knows how to use it carefully enough. He recommends that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. He sees something, he sees it clearly, and he can no longer do anything about it. He dies in January 1924. He is 53 years old. His body is embalmed and placed in a mausoleum on Red Square, which is itself a statement about what the revolution has become. A movement that began by tearing down sacred images, now constructing one of its own. The testament is read by the Central Committee. There is a brief discussion, and then, by collective decision, it is set aside. This is the moment, not Lenin's death, which is merely biological. This is the moment where the chapter's real weight lives. The moment when a group of men who had fought and sacrificed and believed with genuine conviction in something larger than themselves look at a warning written in a dying man's hand and decide, for reasons that each of them could justify. Individually, that acting on it would be too disruptive, too dangerous, too uncertain. Stalin is useful. Stalin is manageable. Stalin is not the most brilliant man in the room, not the most famous, not the most theoretically sophisticated. He is, in fact, the man whom the brilliant men have never fully taken seriously, and perhaps that is why they set the warning aside. Because it is difficult to be afraid of someone you have never entirely respected. Trotsky is the obvious heir. He is famous in a way that Stalin is not. Famous beyond Russia. Famous as the face of the revolution's military triumph. Famous as an orator and a theorist and a public presence. Zinoviev has his base in Leningrad. Bukharin has his theoretical authority. Kamenev has his history. Any of them, in a different kind of organization, might have built the coalition to succeed Lenin. But Stalin has been doing something else entirely. Since 1917, since the days when the brilliant men were making speeches and writing manifestos and arguing about the direction of history, Stalin has been doing the organizational work, the work that no one else wants to do. The work of assigning party posts, who goes where, who reports to whom, who owes what to whom. The work of controlling the flow of information inside the party apparatus. The work of accumulating favors, obligations, loyalties. Not the grand loyalties of ideology, but the small, durable loyalties of men who owe their positions to a specific person and know it. He is the General Secretary, which sounds administrative, almost clerical, and that is precisely how his rivals have understood it. An important position, certainly, but not a glamorous one, not a theoretical one. Not the kind of position that a man of real ambition would settle for. This is the misreading that will cost them everything. What Stalin has understood, and what the men around him have not, is that in a party structured around discipline and hierarchy and the control of information, the person who controls the administrative machinery controls the party, full stop. Not eventually. not in some abstract future. Now. He knows who is loyal to whom. He knows who has said what in what meeting. He knows where the bodies are buried, sometimes literally. And he has been placing, quietly, in position after position, men who are loyal to him. Not to the revolution in the abstract, not to Marxist theory, not to the memory of Lenin, but to him specifically, personally, because he gave them their jobs and can take those jobs away. By the time Lenin's testament is set aside, by the time the Central Committee decides that disruption is worse than risk, Stalin is already in position. The room is already built. The others are already inside it, moving through it freely, debating and arguing and maneuvering in the way that men of genuine intelligence and genuine conviction do, and none of them yet understand that the doors open only from one side. The new world is being constructed. The old one has been broken apart, its bones scattered across the steppe and the forest and the frozen ground of a country that has not stopped bleeding since 1914. On those bones, something is rising, something that carries within it both the genuine idealism of men and women who believed that human society could be remade into something more just, and the machinery of control that will make justice, in the end, impossible to achieve. The idealism is real. The machinery is real. And the man who will determine which one wins is already at his desk, already patient, already waiting in the way that only someone who has been planning for a very long time can wait. Not with the impatience of genius, not with the restlessness of ambition, but with the still absolute certainty, someone who has already counted the pieces and already knows how the game ends. He is not yet the most powerful man in Russia. He will be. And the distance between those two sentences is measured not in years, but in the quiet accumulation of small decisions made in ordinary rooms by a man that almost no one is watching carefully enough. The decade that follows is not announced. It does not arrive with a proclamation or a cannon shot or a single morning when everything changes. It arrives the way a winter arrives in the steppe, gradually at first, then with a completeness that makes it difficult to remember what came before. By 1929, Stalin has made two decisions. He has not written them down in any single document. He has not convened a council or asked for a vote. He has simply decided, in the way that men who have accumulated absolute power decide things, by the slow alignment of his will with the machinery of the state, until the two are indistinguishable. He will transform the Soviet Union into an industrial power at a speed that history has never witnessed. And he will extract the resources to do it from the peasantry, from the 100 million people who still live by the land, who still measure their lives in harvests, who have survived Tsars and civil war and famine, and who now, in the early years of this new decade, are about to be told that the and they farm does not belong to them, and never will again. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture begins as a policy. It becomes, within months, something closer to a war. In Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in the Black Earth regions where the soil is so rich it looks almost purple when it is turned, strangers arrive. They come in groups, sometimes with rifles, sometimes with only the authority of a document and the certainty of men who believe they are on the right side of history. They go to the storehouses. They take the grain, not some of it, all of it. The seed grain too, which means there will be nothing to plant in the spring, which means the hunger that follows is not an accident, but an arithmetic. A peasant family stands in a doorway and watches this happen, and there is nothing to say, because the men doing it have the power of the state behind them, and the ideology of the future, and a quota that must be filled by nightfall. The kulaks, the so-called wealthy peasants, a category so loosely defined that it eventually means anyone who objects are to be liquidated as a class. This is the phrase, liquidated as a class. In practice, it means deportation to Siberia, to the labor camps that are already spreading across the frozen north like a second geography, a shadow country existing alongside the official one. Families are separated. Children arrive at destinations their parents never reach. The ones who remain behind face a famine that the government does not acknowledge and does not relieve, and in some regions actively intensifies by sealing the borders of affected areas so that no one can leave in search of food. In 1932 and 1933, people are dying in the streets of Ukrainian villages. They are dying in the fields. Parents are dying before their children, and children before their parents, and the order of things. The natural order that even the worst historical catastrophes tend to observe is dissolving. The Soviets will later conduct a census. The numbers will not match what the ideology requires. The census will be suppressed. The statisticians who conducted it will be arrested. And that suppression, that silence imposed on its own data by a state that cannot bear what the data says, is not a bureaucratic footnote. It is a confession. It is the Soviet Union, in the language of silence, admitting what it has done. Estimates of the dead range from 3 million to 7 million in Ukraine alone. The full toll across the Soviet Union of this decade of extraction and terror runs higher still. The numbers are disputed, as numbers always are when the state that generated the bodies also controlled the counting. But the range of the dispute does not change the nature of the event. Millions of people died because the government took their food, and the government knew they would die and took the food anyway. And at the same time, this is the thing that the history demands we hold, however uncomfortable the holding. At the same time, the country is building. In the southern Urals, where the steppe meets the first suggestions of mountain, a city is rising from nothing. Magnitogorsk, named for the magnetic mountain at its center, the iron ore mountain that the Soviets are going to tear apart and feed into blast furnaces that burn around the clock, that light up the night sky for miles in every direction. American engineers come to consult and are astonished by the scale and the speed and the cost in human suffering, and go home and write conflicted memoirs. Soviet workers, many of them there not entirely by choice, pour concrete in temperatures that crack it before it sets, and pour it again. The steel that comes out of Magnitogorsk will eventually build tanks. It will help win a war. This is not a small thing. The Dnieper Dam rises across the great river of Ukraine, the river that has run free since before there was a word for Russia, and it becomes the largest hydroelectric dam in the world. And the electricity it generates runs into factories and cities and carries with it the genuine pride of engineers and workers who built something that works, something that is real, something that will outlast the decade that made it. The Moscow Metro opens its first stations in 1935. The stations are marble. They are chandeliered. They are more beautiful than most of the places the people who ride them live. And the people who ride them genuinely feel, something that is not entirely manufactured, a sense that they are part of something large, something modern, something that is moving forward. That feeling is real. It is also being administered. Both things are true. This is the contradiction the Soviet Union can never fully resolve and never fully abandons. The beauty of those metro stations exists in the same decade as the famine. The same state that sealed the borders of starving villages also commissioned marble archways and bronze sculptures for the stations below Moscow's streets. The same ideology that justified the taking of the grain also justified the building of the dam. The writer of history is not permitted to choose between these two realities. He must carry them both, and he must walk slowly enough that the weight of each is felt. Then the revolution turns inward. On the first day of December 1934, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, popular, vigorous, the kind of man around whom futures tend to gather, is shot in the corridor outside his office by a young man named Leonid Nikolaev. The circumstances of the assassination are murky in ways that have never been fully clarified. What is clear is what Stalin does with it. He uses it. The investigation expands. The arrests begin. And the terror that has already consumed the peasantry now turns toward the body of the revolution itself, toward the men and women who made it, who argued it into being, who remember what it was supposed to become, the old Bolsheviks. The people who knew Lenin personally, who debated him, who disagreed with him, who might therefore disagree with Stalin, or who might someday tell a different story about who Stalin was and what the revolution was for. The show trials begin in 1936, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Two men who stood at the very center of the Bolshevik movement, who were there at the beginning, who helped build everything that surrounds them, stand in a Moscow courtroom and confess. They confess to things they did not do. They confess to conspiracies with foreign powers, to sabotage, to plotting the murder of Stalin and the restoration of capitalism. They confess in complete sentences, with the fluency of men who have been educated in the art of argument and who are now deploying that education in the service of their own destruction. And the confessions are believed, or performed as believed, by everyone in the room. This is the strangest thing about the show trials, and the thing worth pausing on longest. These are not ignorant men. These are not men who have been broken into incoherence. They are confessing, publicly, with apparent conviction, and the question of why. The question of what was done to them, what they were promised, what they were threatened with, what logic they arrived at in their cells that made this seem like the correct or the only or the final thing to do. That question sits at the center of the decade like a stone that cannot be moved or explained away. Nikolai Bukharin comes last in 1938. He was perhaps the most intellectually gifted of all the old Bolsheviks, the one Lenin called the darling of the party, the one who genuinely believed in what he was doing, who wrote the theoretical frameworks that others used, who argued against the pace of collectivization and was right about the consequences and was destroyed for being right. He confesses too. He is shot in March of 1938. He is 39 years old. Leon Trotsky watches from a distance that keeps increasing. He is in Turkey, then France, then Norway, then Mexico, each expulsion pushing him further from the center of the revolution he helped make. He writes. He analyzes. He argues that Stalin has betrayed the revolution, that what exists in the Soviet Union is not socialism, but a bureaucratic deformation, that history will correct the error. He is the one witness to all of this who retains his clarity and his voice and his anger, and he is the one person Stalin cannot reach through the courts. He reaches him another way. In August of 1940, in Coyoacan, a man named Ramon Mercader drives an ice axe into the back of Trotsky's skull. He dies the following day. The revolution has now consumed everyone who might remember it differently. The purge does not stop with the old Bolsheviks. It moves through the party, through the intelligentsia, through the scientific establishment, through the arts. A poet writes the wrong thing and disappears. An engineer is accused of sabotage and confesses and is shot. A factory manager misses a quota and is arrested for wrecking. The categories of guilt expand until they are everywhere, until suspicion is the atmosphere everyone breathes, until the safest thing a person can do is to accuse someone else before someone else accuses them. And then it reaches the military. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union are shot. 13 of the 15 army commanders are removed from their positions. 35,000 officers, men who know how to read a map, how to coordinate an artillery barrage, how to move a division across a river, are imprisoned or executed or driven from service. The Red Army that emerges from the purge is an army with its spine removed. It has weapons and it has soldiers, and it has almost no one left who knows how to use them together. This detail sits here quietly at the end of this terrible decade, like a debt that has not yet come due. It will come due. And when it does, the cost will be paid not by the man who made this decision, but by the soldiers who have to fight without the officers who should have led them. by 1939, the Soviet Union is an industrial power. This is true. It has steel mills and dams and a metro system and a literate population and a scientific establishment capable of genuine and significant work. It has built, in a single decade, an infrastructure that other nations required generations to assemble. The achievement is real. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most remarkable feats of state-directed transformation in modern history. It is also killed by deliberate policy and by the famine that policy produced, somewhere between 6 and 10 million of its own citizens in that same decade. It has imprisoned or exiled millions more. It has destroyed its own military leadership on the eve of the most dangerous moment in its history. It has built a system of surveillance and accusation so thorough that the fear it generates requires no further maintenance. The people maintain it themselves, for each other, because the cost of not doing so is too high to contemplate. Stalin sits at the center of all of this, with something that is not quite satisfaction and not quite peace, but is perhaps the closest thing to those states that a man of his particular construction can reach. He is certain. That is the word. Not happy, not comfortable, not loved, certain. Certain that what he has done was necessary. Certain that the deaths were the price of the future. Certain that history, the great impersonal force that he and Lenin and all the Bolsheviks believed in with something very close to religious conviction, will read the ledger his way. That certainty is, in the end, more frightening than the cruelty. The cruelty is almost comprehensible. Men have been cruel before, for reasons that can be traced, for fears that can be named. But the certainty, the absolute, untroubled conviction that the accounting will come out right, that the millions dead are a line item in a larger calculation that justifies them, that is something harder to hold in the mind. It requires a relationship to other human beings that most of us, fortunately, cannot quite imagine. He is 59 years old. He has remade a country. He has killed an enormous portion of it. He believes these two things are the same project, and he is not finished. And somewhere to the west, in the chancelleries and barracks of another country built on a different kind of certainty, another man is looking at maps. The morning of June 22, 1941, begins in silence. Along a front of nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic coast down through the marshes of Belarus and across the Ukrainian steppe to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers wait in the dark. 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, the largest military operation in human history, and in the final minutes before it begins, the silence is almost complete. The kind of silence that exists not because there is nothing to hear, but because everything is holding its breath. At 4 in the morning, it ends. The artillery opens first, a continuous rolling thunder that the people living in the border villages hear as something they have no word for, something outside the range of any sound they have encountered in their lives. The planes cross at low altitude, and what they find on the Soviet airfields is almost too easy. Aircraft lined up in neat rows, not dispersed, not hidden, not prepared. The Soviet Air Force loses more than 1,200 planes on the first day. Most of them never leave the ground. They burn where they sit in the early summer light, and the smoke rising from them is the first signal to anyone watching from a distance that something unprecedented is happening. Stalin is at his Dachau outside Moscow. The reports begin arriving within the first hours, and for a man who has spent 20 years constructing a system in which all information flows toward him and all decisions flow outward from him, the information arriving now does not fit any framework he has built. He has received, by some counts, more than 80 separate intelligence warnings about a German invasion in the months preceding this morning. He has dismissed them, some as British provocations designed to draw the Soviet Union into conflict, some as misinformation planted by German intelligence, some simply as the anxious overcaution of subordinates who do not see what he sees. He has, in his certainty, ordered border commanders not to respond to German provocations. He has signed trade agreements with Berlin through the spring. He has, in his confidence in his own reading of events, made the catastrophe more catastrophic. And now it is here, and by some accounts he does not speak publicly for 11 days. This is not, or not simply, cowardice. It is something more psychologically precise than that. A man whose entire system of authority rests on the premise of his own infallibility, confronting the proof of his fallibility on a scale that cannot be managed or minimized or redirected. The whole architecture of Stalinist power is built on the idea that he sees more clearly than others, that his instincts are more reliable, that his judgments are not subject to revision. And here, in the first hours of the largest invasion in history, is the consequence of that architecture. The man at the center of it sits in his dasha, and the center does not hold. The generals who might have organized the defense are not there. This is the weight that has been building since 1937, since the purges swept through the officer corps with a thoroughness that left the Red Army gutted of its most experienced commanders. Marshal Tukhachevsky, who understood modern mechanized warfare, is dead. Dozens of corps and division commanders are dead or in camps. The men who remain are often younger, less experienced, promoted into roles they are not yet ready to fill, and they are operating now under a doctrine that has not been updated, along a border that has not been properly fortified, with supply chains that have not been adequately prepared. The disasters of the summer of 1941 are not simply the result of German military genius. Though that genius is real, they are the result of decisions made in Moscow between 1937 and 1941, in offices and interrogation rooms far from this border. And the bill for those decisions arrives now in full, all at once. The German army groups drive east with a speed that stuns even their own commanders. Army Group Center moves toward Moscow. Army Group North moves toward Leningrad. Army Group South moves toward Kiev and the Ukrainian breadbasket, and beyond it, the oil fields of the Caucasus, which Hitler believes will end the war by ending Soviet industrial capacity. In the first weeks, the encirclements are enormous. At Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, entire Soviet armies surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured in single operations. By the autumn, the Germans have taken more prisoners than most nations have soldiers. The numbers resist comprehension. The maps show arrows driving east like something unstoppable, like weather. And yet something is happening that the maps do not fully show. The Soviet state, for all its catastrophic unpreparedness, does not collapse the way France collapsed, the way the smaller nations of Europe collapsed. It absorbs losses that would have ended any other state in history and continues to function. Partly this is geography. The sheer distances involved begin to work against the attacker as the summer turns to autumn. Partly it is the nature of the regime itself, which has spent 20 years building structures of control and mobilization that, whatever their human cost, are now capable of directing enormous resources toward a single purpose. And partly it is something harder to name. The stubbornness of ordinary people who are fighting on their own ground, for their own families, in a war that comes to feel, correctly, like a war of extermination. Because the Germans are not simply conquering, they are killing. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war is a deliberate policy of murder. More than 3 million Soviet prisoners die in German captivity, of starvation, exposure, and direct killing. The Einsatzgruppen follow the advancing armies, and in ravines and forests across the occupied territories, they conduct massacres of a scale and efficiency that will not be fully understood until after the war is over. The village of Babi Yar, the forests of Ponary, the pits outside 100 unnamed towns. The people of the Soviet Union are being told, by the actions of the invader, exactly what their defeat would mean. It means the end of them. Stalin speaks on July 3rd. He calls them brothers and sisters. He calls it the Great Patriotic War. The word patriotic is not accidental. The appeal is not to Marxist internationalism or the vanguard of the proletariat. It is to something older and deeper, to the memory of 1812, to the soil itself, to the idea that this land belongs to the people who have worked it and bled on it and buried their dead in it. The ideological framework of the Soviet state is, in this moment, quietly set aside in favor of something more elemental, and the people respond to it because the thing being defended is real, whatever the nature of the state defending it. In the autumn, the decision is made that will define the industrial character of the war. The factories move east. This is one of those moments in history where the sheer scale of human effort becomes almost impossible to hold in the mind. 1,500 major industrial enterprises, steel mills, tank factories, munitions plants, locomotive works, are disassembled and loaded onto trains and moved east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, to the Urals and Siberia and Kazakhstan. The machinery is loaded in the order it will need to be reassembled. Workers travel with it, sleeping in the cars alongside the equipment they have operated for years. The trains run day and night. When they arrive at the sites chosen for the new factories, the ground is frozen and the roofs are not yet built, and the workers begin reassembling the machinery anyway, in the open air, in temperatures that reach 40 below zero, because the tanks and the guns are needed at the front before the buildings can be completed. Some of them work in coats so heavy they can barely move. Some of them work until they fall asleep standing and are carried to shelter by their neighbors. The production lines begin running before the walls go up around them. This is what Soviet collective endurance looks like in its purest form. Not heroism in the dramatic sense, but the willingness of ordinary people to perform extraordinary labor under conditions that should be impossible, because the alternative is the end of everything. The factories east of the Urals will eventually outproduce the entire German war economy. The decision to move them is made in the first weeks of the invasion, in the middle of military catastrophe, and it is one of the reasons the war ends the way it does. The siege of Leningrad begins in September of 1941 and does not end until January of 1944. For nearly 900 days, the city of Leningrad, Peter's city, the old capital, the city of the Hermitage and the Neva and the White Knights, is encircled and starved. The daily bread ration falls to 125 grams for civilians not engaged in physical labor. That is less than a quarter pound. People eat paste made from wallpaper glue. They eat leather. They eat things that cannot be named. The dead in the winter of 1941 and 1942 lie in the streets because there is no one with enough strength to carry them. More than 1 million civilians die in the siege. The exact number is still uncertain, and the city does not surrender. It holds, and it holds, and it holds, and eventually the ring is broken, and the city survives, and what it carries forward is not triumph exactly, but something more solemn than triumph, a knowledge of what human beings are capable of enduring when the alternative is unthinkable. Stalingrad is the pivot. By the summer of 1942, the German offensive is driving south and east toward the oil fields, and the city on the Volga that bears Stalin's name becomes the place where the war turns. The battle begins in August and does not end until February of 1943, and in the months between, it becomes something that neither side fully planned and neither side can escape. A struggle for a single city that comes to carry the symbolic weight of the entire war. The Germans fight street by street. The Soviets fight building by building, floor by floor, room by room. There are engagements conducted across distances of a few meters, in the ruins of factories and apartment blocks, in the dark. The Soviet commanders understand that the closer the fighting, the less the Germans can use their air power, and so they deliberately close the distance, deliberately turn the battle into something that negates German tactical advantages and demands only the willingness to hold. In November, the Soviet counteroffensive encircles the German Sixth Army, 300,000 soldiers surrounded. By February, 90,000 survivors surrender, including a field marshal, and the German advance into the Soviet Union is over. What follows over the next 2 years is the largest sustained offensive operation in the history of warfare. The Red Army driving west from Stalingrad to Kursk to Kiev to Warsaw to the Oder River to Berlin itself, pushing the Wehrmacht back across every mile it has taken, and further, until in the spring of 1945, Soviet soldiers stand in the ruins of the German capital and raise a flag over the Reichstag. The cost of this victory is almost beyond the capacity of numbers to hold. More than 20 million Soviet citizens are dead. Some estimates go higher. Military dead, civilian dead, the dead of the siege cities, the dead of the occupied territories, the dead in German camps, the dead of famine and exposure, and the 1,000 ways that total war kills people who are nowhere near the fighting. Every Soviet family has its dead. There is no community, no village, no apartment building in the entire country that does not have an absence at its center, a name that will not come home, a chair at a table that will not be filled. The wound is not metaphorical, it is demographic, it is architectural. It is written into the landscape itself, in the burned villages and the mass graves and the cities that have to be rebuilt from nothing, because nothing is what the Germans left behind. And yet the victory is real. This is the thing that makes the Great Patriotic War the central fact of Soviet identity for the rest of the country's existence. Not the ideology, not the 5-year plans, not Sputnik, or the collective farms, or the achievements of socialist construction. The war. The proof that the system could absorb the worst that history could inflict and survive it. The shared experience of suffering and endurance and ultimate triumph that gives the Soviet project an emotional legitimacy it has never had before and will spend the next 4 decades drawing on. When the Soviet state needs its citizens to believe, it returns to this. When it needs to justify sacrifice, it points to this. The 20 million dead become a kind of permanent argument. This is what we have been through together. This is what we are. This is what we owe to the memory of those who did not come back. Stalin emerges from the war as something he was not before. This is perhaps the most complicated truth of 1945. The man who dismissed the intelligence warnings, who purged the generals, who left the border units exposed, who sat in silence for 11 days while the catastrophe unfolded. This man is now genuinely credited with saving the nation, and not without reason. He is the one who did not flee Moscow in October 1941 when the Germans were close enough that the smoke from burning documents could be smelled in the streets. He is the one who stood on the reviewing stand in November of that year and sent soldiers directly from the parade to the front. He is the one who held the state together by the force of his authority and his will, and his absolute refusal to consider defeat. The credit is real. The irony is real. The man most responsible for the catastrophe of 1941 is also genuinely the man who led the nation through it, and the Soviet people who have paid the price for both facts are now asked to hold them together as a single story. Most of them do. Because the dead are theirs, and the victory is theirs, and the war is the one experience large enough to contain everything. The suffering and the endurance, the loss and the triumph, the 20 million absent faces and the flag over Berlin. The war ends in May of 1945, and the Soviet Union that emerges from it is not the same country that entered it. It is larger in its reach, holding half of Europe in its orbit, its military prestige immense, its voice in the New World Order impossible to ignore. But it is also devastated in ways that will take a generation to repair, and it is led by a man whose wartime authority has confirmed in him the belief that his instincts are always correct, that the disasters of 1941 were not his failures but history's tests, and that the methods which built this tight and defended this state are the methods that will be required to sustain it. He is 65 years old. He has survived everything. He believes he has been proven right by everything. And the belief itself, undisturbed by any check, uncorrected by any voice willing to tell him what he does not want to hear, will define the years ahead in ways that the exhausted, grieving, triumphant people of the Soviet Union cannot yet foresee. The war is over. The wound is real and it is permanent, and it is shared by every person in this vast country, from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the deserts of the South. They have survived together. They will carry it together. And the state that asks them to carry it is already looking forward, already calculating, already turning the sacred grief of 20 million dead into the architecture of the next chapter, which is a different kind of war, fought in different ways, in a world that the Great Patriotic War has remade entirely.